Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the harshest and most unbearable labours that men and women endured in the Middle Ages, trades so foul, so perilous, or so crushing that few today could last even a single day within them. These were the unseen toilers of towns, fields and castles, whose sweat and suffering upheld the very foundations of medieval life. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honour, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. I remember the silence of the town after curfew, when only the shuffle of hidden feet disturbed the dark. It was in those hours that the gong farmers emerged, carrying wooden spades and buckets, moving toward the pits beneath houses and taverns. No lantern was bright enough to cut through the stench. It clung to the throat, making even the strongest gag. Yet these men pressed on, for someone had to clear away what the living left behind. The pits they emptied were cesspools of medieval life, filled with human waste and the filth of animals, stagnant and rotting in silence. The farmers climbed into these holes, often waist-deep, shoveling muck into pails until their arms trembled. Some wore rough leather to shield their skin, but most had little more than rags. Inhaling that air for too long sickened many, and coughs became companions they could not silence. It was a labour that stripped away dignity. Though despised, they were not without reward. The Crown and city councils knew well the necessity of their labour, so their wages were higher than those of many craftsmen. Yet silver could not buy them respect, nor companionship free of scorn. Even their neighbours avoided them, for the stench of their work never left their clothes, nor their skin. They were marked by odour and by reputation, no matter how faithfully they served. Disease lurked in every spadeful of waste. Dysentery, cholera, and countless unnamed fevers spread easily from those pits. Few lived long in this trade, and yet new hands always replaced the fallen, for poverty drove men to accept even this. To survive, they laboured when others slept, unseen and unthanked. The irony was bitter. They preserved health, yet their own was steadily destroyed. In villages, their work carried into the fields. Waste became fertilizer when spread across farmland, returning to the cycle of bread and hunger. The same filth that endangered the body was transformed into nourishment for the soil. The farmer's burden thus linked the darkness of the cesspit with the light of the harvest. Such was the strange balance of medieval survival, written in foul labour and silent endurance. I often wondered if they ever grew numb to the smell, or if each night's descent into foulness struck them as freshly as the first. They bore not only the weight of their buckets, but also the crushing weight of shame. A man could swing a sword and be cheered, but a man who carried waste was spat upon. The world drew lines not by courage or necessity, but by the odour of one's trade. It is easy now to laugh at the memory of such work, as if it belonged to another kind of people. But the truth is simpler. They were as human as any knight, mother, or monk, and their strength was no less real. Few among us could endure a single night in their place. The gong farmer's task was as vital as the ringing of a church bell, though history seldom sings their name. And so, I recall them with quiet respect. In the shadows of towns, while all else slept, they waged their battle not with sword or lance, but with spade and bucket. Their war was against filth itself, against disease, against the decay that threatened every medieval hearth. Forgotten by many, cursed by others, they yet carried a duty that kept entire cities alive. Without them, we might not have survived the dawn. There are memories of marshes at dawn, when the mist hung low and the air was damp with silence. Into those waters waded the leech collectors, bare-legged and resolute, waiting for the creatures to fasten themselves to their skin. Every bite drew blood, and every step deeper into the mire was a bargain with weakness. What they gathered fed the hunger of medicine, though it often drained their own strength in the process. Physicians in the Middle Ages placed great faith in bloodletting, believing it could balance the humours of the body. For this reason, leeches were in constant demand across monasteries, apothecaries, and noble courts. The collectors supplied this need, risking their health in the swamps and ponds of Europe. With no gloves, no boots, only flesh offered freely, their work was as dangerous as it was indispensable. The small parasites clung fiercely, their teeth sawing through skin with ease. Collectors scraped them off with knives or fingernails, tossing them into clay jars filled with water. The wounds left behind bled long after, leaving the worker pale and weak. Infections were common, as the water itself carried unseen dangers that seeped into open flesh. Still, they returned to the marshes, for hunger pressed harder than the pain of leeches. Many of these labourers were women, especially in the British Isles, where records speak of poor villagers gathering leeches to sell. Some stood in the water for hours, shivering until their bones ached, just to fill a handful of jars. The market for leeches was steady, and though the price per creature was low, the volume kept families alive. The marsh became both their torment and their lifeline. Cold was as dangerous as the leech itself. The waters numbed the feet and legs, robbing collectors of warmth even in summer. In winter, the work was near unbearable, yet still undertaken. Hypothermia and fever often followed, and there was no physician who would waste his own leeches on those who gathered them. It was a cruel irony to serve medicine but be denied its care. Parasites other than leeches thrived in those wetlands. Worms, fevers, and skin diseases plagued the collectors as much as the creatures they sought. Every season added new scars, both visible and hidden, yet still the work went on. The body became a tool, no less than the spade of a digger or the hammer of a smith, worn down in service of others. Those who lived in towns scarcely thought of the hands that gathered the leeches pressed to their veins. They feared the pain of bloodletting, yet rarely imagined the greater suffering endured before the jars reached the physician's bench. The collectors were nameless to most, faceless in the chain of survival, their sacrifice overlooked in the pursuit of health. It was the unseen burden of the medieval poor. When I think of them now, I hear the quiet ripple of water and see pale figures rising from the mist, jars in hand, skin dotted with wounds. They carried on with no armour, no shield, only endurance as their companion. Their labour filled the coffers of doctors and the trust of patients, but it emptied their own bodies day by day. That is the memory of the leech collectors, guardians of blood who paid in blood themselves. I can still see the carts, creaking through narrow streets, piled high with bodies wrapped in rough cloth or left bare to the flies. The sound of their wheels was as dreadful as any trumpet of war, for it told of death multiplied beyond counting. Those who guided them were men marked by fear and necessity, chosen or forced to remove the dead when no one else dared. Their task was not of choice, but of grim survival for the living. During the Black Death, the air itself seemed heavy with sorrow. Families abandoned their own, too terrified to carry the sick or the dead. It was the buriers who entered the houses, dragging corpses into the daylight, while neighbours watched from shuttered windows. They worked with little protection, sometimes covering their faces with vinegar-soaked cloth, hoping in vain to guard against the unseen pestilence. Most of them knew they would not live long. The bodies were heaped into pits, dug hastily on the edge of towns. Earth was scarce compared to the number of dead, so layer upon layer of flesh was pressed together, then covered thinly with soil. Bells tolled endlessly, not for each soul, but for the multitude, while the buriers dug without pause. Their spades turned not only soil, but the weight of despair, for they laboured in silence broken only by prayers whispered under breath. Pay was offered, sometimes in coin, sometimes in food. Yet what use was silver when every breath might be your last? Few volunteered for this labour, many were forced by decree. Some prisoners and the poorest of the poor became barriers, their lives already weighed as lesser by society. Yet in truth, they bore a duty that none of higher station could endure. They were the last hands to touch the dead. Some accounts tell of simple masks, beaked and filled with herbs, worn by a handful of barriers and physicians alike. But these were rare, more symbolic than protective. Most walked unguarded, their skin kissed by the same air that carried death from house to house. They burned rosemary, sage, or juniper as they worked, believing smoke could cleanse the plague. It gave more comfort to the spirit than safety to the body. No one envied their labor, but all relied on it. Without barriers, towns would have drowned in corpses, disease spreading faster still. In many cities, they became outcasts, avoided even by those they served, for fear that their hands carried contagion. Loneliness became their companion, a silence deeper than the grave, broken only by the tolling of death's summons. Their sacrifice was survival for the many. I recall how some would sing psalms as they carried their grim loads, voices trembling against the darkness. Perhaps it was prayer, perhaps defiance, or perhaps simply a way to still their own terror. The sound drifted through streets emptied of laughter, turning the city into a hushed cathedral of grief. In that music, there was both courage and sorrow woven together. When I close my eyes, I see them standing at the edge of a pit, spades in hand, sweat mingling with tears. They were men whose lives burned quickly, consumed by the very work they performed. Yet though they died in silence, their service gave breath to countless others. The plague barriers walked among shadows so that a little light might remain for the living. The craft of cloth began not with beauty, but with filth. In towns across Europe, the fuller's yard was filled with vats of stale urine, collected from homes and inns, left to ferment until its stench turned the air sour. Into these tubs, woolen cloth was plunged, and men stepped barefoot into the liquid, treading steadily to cleanse and thicken the fibers. It was a rhythm without music, a march through stench and fumes that burned the lungs. Urine was prized not for its smell, but for the ammonia it carried, which stripped grease and oil from raw wool. Without this cleansing, fabric would never soften into the cloth needed for garments, blankets, or banners. The work demanded hours of stomping, the feet raw and blistered, the body bent with strain. Each step was a reminder that even the noblest robe began in degradation. The air around the fuller's yard was heavy and foul. Neighbours despised living near the workshops, for the odour seeped into every alley, clinging to walls and skin. Children mocked those who laboured there, calling them unclean, though their parents relied on the cloth for warmth. Such was the irony of medieval life. The very hands most reviled crafted the goods most desired. Respect rarely followed necessity. There was danger beyond disgust. Breathing the fumes caused coughing and sores within the chest, while contact burned skin and left wounds festering. Yet men endured, for the pay, though modest, was steadier than many fields of labour. Guilds eventually formed, and fullers gained some protection under their banners. Still, no guild crest could mask the odour that declared their trade from afar. In some regions, water-driven hammers replaced feet, pounding the cloth in mechanical rhythm. But in many towns, especially in the earlier centuries, it was still the press of human legs that did the work. To watch them labour was to see men transformed into tools, their bodies as much a part of the process as the vats themselves. The line between flesh and craft blurred in the reek of the yard. Even monasteries required the service of fullers. Monks needed habits, and great abbeys demanded cloth for trade. Yet the holy houses often kept the fulling yards at a distance, unwilling to endure their foulness within cloister walls. The fuller's role, though indispensable, remained always on the margin, like smoke that drifted outside the sacred halls. They were needed, but never embraced. I sometimes recall the dignity hidden in their toil. Beneath the fumes and shame, they created the cloth that clothed knights, peasants, and kings alike. Without their patience, No market would have displayed bright-dyed fabrics. No lord would have worn a surcoat, no pilgrim a warm cloak. Their suffering wove silently into every stitch worn by those who never thought of the cost. The fullers worked not for glory, but survival. Their yards were places where endurance met necessity, where men gave their bodies so that cloth could live. They stood ankle-deep in waste, yet from their labour came warmth, beauty, and protection for countless souls. When the streets filled with the colour of dyed cloth, no passerby thought of them, but I remember. I always remember. Across the squares of Europe, when justice was to be served, all eyes turned to a single figure. He stood apart from the crowd, masked or hooded, tools in hand, his presence both feared and despised. The executioner was not born into honour, but into a role society demanded yet shunned. His duty was to end lives at the command of the law, and with every stroke he carried the weight of dread. The tasks were many: beheadings for nobles, hangings for thieves, burnings for heretics. Each act required precision, yet even the most skilled faltered when the human body resisted clean death. A misjudged swing of the sword brought chaos, the crowd jeering or raging, and sometimes violence turned back upon the man meant to deliver justice. To err was not only to fail, but to risk one's own life in the square. Despite the horror of his work, the executioner was well compensated. He received coins, food, and sometimes the right to claim the clothing or possessions of the condemned. Yet silver could not buy companionship or honour. Neighbours crossed the street to avoid him, taverns barred his entry, and churches often relegated his family to the back pews. His was a life paid in coin, but denied in dignity. The burden was not only social, but inward. Imagine carrying the memory of 100 dying faces, their last words and desperate cries echoing long after the scaffold was silent. Some drank heavily to numb the weight. Others retreated into solitude, for the human spirit can only endure so much death before it begins to fracture. Even those who lived long did not live light. In certain towns, executioners became strange figures of both fear and utility. They were sometimes asked to handle tasks others dared not touch: the slaughtering of animals, the disposal of carcasses, or even the cleaning of cesspits. Their hands were already stained in the eyes of society, so no further dishonour was thought possible. They bore the filth of life and the blood of death alike. Children grew under the same curse. The sons of executioners often inherited the role, for few outside families of the trade wished to marry into such infamy. Whole lineages became bound to the scaffold, generation after generation living in shadows. It was a cycle as unyielding as the rope itself, binding not only the condemned, but those who wielded the blade. In time, some sought to humanize their craft. Records tell of executioners sharpening blades carefully, practicing cuts upon animals, determined to give swifter ends than those before them. It was a strange kind of mercy, hidden beneath the mask of horror. In their own way, they too wrestled with the question of what it meant to be just, even as they served a justice written by kings and courts. When I think of them now, I see not monsters, but men trapped in a role none would choose. They were outcasts, who bore the hatred of all, yet they performed the duties demanded by the very same hands that scorned them. Their place in history is not of honour, yet it is carved deep, a reminder that justice often wears a cruel face. And still, the executioner walked home alone. In every medieval town, the tanner's quarter lay apart, downwind, where the stench would not choke the nobles or the priests. There, hides of cattle, sheep, and goats were brought from slaughterhouses, heavy with blood and hair. The air was thick with smoke, dung, and decay, for leather could not be born without passing first through filth. It was a place where the earth itself seemed stained, and the sky hung low with foul vapours. The process began with soaking hides in lime to loosen hair and flesh. Men scraped them clean with iron knives, their hands blistered and raw from caustic touch. The skins were then plunged into pits of dog dung or urine, where they softened under a chemical rot. Hours were spent mixing and stirring with bare limbs, the fumes gnawing at eyes and lungs. To endure the task was to sacrifice comfort, breath, and health. Odour was the constant companion of the tanner. It clung to their skin, soaked their clothes, and filled their homes. No matter how they washed, the smell travelled with them into market and church. Townsfolk turned away, wrinkling noses, whispering scorn. Children mocked, women avoided, and yet the same people depended on their work to walk shod, to gird with belts, to ride with saddles. Hypocrisy walked hand in hand with disgust. The hides, once cleaned and softened, were stretched on frames to dry, pulled tight with cords until they cracked into form. Tools pounded, scraped, and smoothed, shaping raw flesh into usable leather. Sun and rain alike fell upon the workers as they toiled in the open. The noise of hammering echoed beside the stench, a rhythm of necessity that built the bones of medieval trade. Danger lurked at every stage. Lime burned the skin, dung carried disease, and blades slipped with fatal precision. Few tanners reached old age without scars across their hands and arms, testaments to years of handling hides. Their lungs weakened, their backs bent, yet still they pressed on, for their families needed bread and the towns needed leather. Survival demanded submission to the reek. Though despised, the tanner's craft held quiet power. Without leather, armies marched barefoot. Monks lacked bindings for books. Merchants could not pack their wares, and riders lost the reins of their horses. Every level of society touched their work, from serf to sovereign. They were outcasts, yet they stitched the fabric of daily life with hides hardened in their pits. Some towns forced them to live beyond the walls, banishing their yards to riverbanks where filth could be carried downstream. Yet leather returned through the gates, transformed into gloves for nobles and armor for knights. The paradox was bitter. Society consumed what it condemned, cloaking itself in goods born of labor it refused to acknowledge with honor. Still, the work continued, silent and unthanked. When I recall their yards, I smell the acrid bite of lime and the sour rot of dung, and I see men bent low over frames of drying hide. They bore no banners, no songs, no triumphs in chronicles, but their work endured in every saddle strapped, every boot worn, every shield bound. The tanners lived with the curse of odour, yet their craft left a legacy stronger than stone. Far from the bustle of town, where limestone hills rose pale against the sky, fires burned day and night in great stone kilns. There the lime burners laboured, feeding flames that devoured rock and left behind quicklime, a powder as useful as it was deadly. Their days were measured not by bells or seasons, but by the constant roar of fire and the clouds of dust that choked the air. Quicklime was prized in building, for it bound stones into cathedrals and castles, and in farming, where it sweetened soils. Yet its creation demanded sacrifice. Limestone was loaded into towering kilns, layered with fuel, and kept burning for days. The heat blistered skin, sparks seared the eyes, and every breath carried dust sharp enough to scar the lungs. Each task carried risk, and none were spared. When the stone cracked under fire, it turned to white powder that hissed upon touching water, releasing caustic fumes. A careless hand, a sudden gust, and skin could be eaten raw by its bite. Eyes clouded, flesh blistered, and men bore burns as common as calluses. There was no mercy in the kiln's glow, only the demand for vigilance without end. Clothing could not protect them, for fabric itself withered under the dust. The air filled with a fine haze that settled on skin, hair, and tongue, making every meal taste of stone. Many coughed their lives away, their chests tightening until breath itself became labour. They were buried early, their lungs as heavy as the blocks they once fired for the builders of kingdoms. Despite these dangers, the world could not advance without them. Cathedrals rose skyward, their mortar mixed with the lime from these fires. Castles held strong walls, fields bore heavier harvests, and cities spread wider, all upon the silent toll of the burners' sacrifice. Their labour was hidden from praise, but their mark lay in every stone that endured the centuries. Few wished to live near them, for the smell of burning limestone was acrid and sour, drifting on the wind. Their homes stood apart, their families touched by the same dust that ate at their bodies. Isolation became their companion, a price paid not only by the worker, but by all who shared his blood. Communities shunned them, yet depended on their product at every turn. It is said that some found pride in their craft, knowing that without their kilns, the very heart of Christendom would falter. Perhaps that pride was all that kept them steady before the furnace, when heat and dust closed in like enemies without faces. Pride cannot heal the lungs, but it can keep a man standing one day longer before the fire. When I think on lime burners, I see men standing in the glow of their kilns, their bodies silhouetted against flames that never slept. They gave their years to dust and their skin to burns, and in return left behind monuments that still rise against the sky. Their lives were consumed in smoke, yet their legacy was written in stone. In the narrow alleys and grain-filled storehouses of medieval towns, rats thrived in shadows. Their scratching feet and gnawing teeth echoed in the night, bringing dread to households that knew well the sickness they carried. To face them stood the rat catchers, men with nets, dogs, or ferrets trained to hunt in the dark. Their work was as loathed as the creatures themselves, yet cities leaned on their skill to keep plague and hunger at bay. Rats were more than a nuisance, they were vessels of destruction. They devoured stored grain, spoiled food, and chewed through wood, threatening both larders and homes. Worse still, the fleas that clung to their bodies spread the Black Death, making each rat a shadow of death in furred disguise. Those who trapped them risked infection with every bite or scratch, yet there was no shortage of vermin to chase. Methods varied from place to place. Some carried cages of ferrets, slipping them into burrows and walls to flush out the rodents into waiting nets. Others brought terriers, sharp and quick, snapping necks in an instant. Traps baited with scraps of meat or grain were laid along corners, snapping shut with brutal efficiency. The rat catcher needed cunning as much as courage, for his foes were small but relentless. Payment was meagre, often a few coins per rat, or a share of the grain saved. Town councils hired them during outbreaks, promising rewards for every carcass delivered. Some even paraded their kills through streets as proof of service, dangling tails like grim trophies. Yet despite their role in saving lives and food, they were treated with disdain, the stench of their work marking them as unclean. There was constant peril in handling diseased animals. Bites swelled into festering wounds, fevers struck without warning, and some rat catchers vanished into the grave as swiftly as the vermin they hunted. They walked a narrow line between serving their neighbours and sharing the fate of those they sought to protect. Their trade was survival paid with risk at every turn. The reputation of rat catchers grew strange in time. Some whispered they bred vermin in secret, ensuring endless demand for their skills. Others feared them as men too comfortable with filth and death, their presence unsettled, for they moved in spaces decent folk avoided, cellars, ditches, and rotting heaps. Suspicion clung to them as tightly as the rats clung to the shadows, yet without them, towns would have drowned in infestation. Bakers kept their flour, brewers their grain, and households their scraps, because someone dared to wage war against the swarming tide. Their unglamorous labour was a quiet form of defence, no less vital than the swords of guards or the stones of walls. They were soldiers in an unseen battle, their victories counted in silence. When I call them to mind, I see gaunt figures with dogs at their heels, lanterns swinging, stepping into the dark corners where no one else would tread. Their hands bore the scars of bites, their clothes the smell of decay, yet they pressed on. They were men half feared, half needed, always on the edge of society. In hunting rats, they fought the plague itself, though none would cheer their names. Beneath the earth, where sunlight never reached, men descended into shafts cut through stone and soil. The air was heavy, damp and close, lit only by faint flickers of tallow lamps. Here worked the miners, chipping away at veins of silver, iron and tin, their lives bound to the pick and the shovel. Every breath tasted of earth. Every heartbeat echoed with the weight of mountains pressing above. The tools were crude. Little more than hammers, chisels, and wooden supports braced against collapsing walls. Tunnels twisted deep into the dark, some no higher than a crouching man, others plunging steep and narrow. Water seeped from cracks, flooding passages until men worked knee-deep in cold mud. The sound of stone cracking was constant, a reminder that at any moment the earth might take them back into itself. Ventilation was poor, and the deeper they went, the thinner the air became. Fumes gathered, stealing breath and burning lungs. Some miners fell where they stood, struck by unseen vapors that snuffed out life as swiftly as a candle's flame. Dust filled their chests, settling deep until coughing racked their bodies day and night. The miner's wage was coin in the hand, but death already whispered in his lungs. Collapses were feared most of all. A single groan in the timbers sent men scrambling, for they knew the weight of stone could crush without warning. When supports failed, tunnels became tombs, entombing men whose names were scarcely remembered. Families waited above, listening for news that often never came. The mine gave riches to lords and crowns, but grief to those who dug. And yet, their work built the world of that age. Iron forged swords and ploughs, silver minted the coins of kings, tin mixed into bronze for bells and vessels. Cathedrals gleamed with leaded glass, castles rose with nails and hinges, all drawn from the miner's toil. Though hidden beneath the earth, their labour touched every surface of life, unseen but indispensable. Children sometimes followed their fathers into the shafts, carrying baskets of stone or water to the surface. Their bodies bent early, their strength consumed before manhood. Women too laboured nearby, washing ore, breaking stones, or tending fires that smelted the metals. Entire communities grew around the mines, bound together by hardship, bound tighter still by poverty. Few lived long in this calling, and those who did bore scars both visible and hidden. Their backs bent, their eyes dim, their breath shallow and strained. Still, they endured, for the promise of wages, however small, was stronger than hunger. In the silence of the deep, where every strike of the pick rang like a prayer, survival was hammered out one blow at a time. When I recall the miners, I do not see only darkness. I see men carrying the light of their small lamps, pressing forward despite fear, carving passages through stone so others might build above. Their world was one of dust and danger, yet their legacy shone in every bell that tolled, every sword that clashed, every coin that passed from hand to hand. They were keepers of the hidden veins of the earth. In the heart of every town, vats of boiling liquid fumed with colours that dazzled the eyes, yet poisoned the air. Dyers bent over these cauldrons, stirring cloth into shades that nobles flaunted with pride, and peasants envied in silence. The work was as noxious as it was essential, for behind every robe of scarlet or cloak of green lay hours spent breathing vapours that scarred the lungs. The beauty worn above was bought with suffering below. The materials of their craft were gathered from far and near. Woad brought blue from fields, madder root yielded red, and weld gave bright yellow. But to fix these hues, harsh chemicals were used: alum, lye, and sometimes arsenic or lead. Some colours demanded rarities: cochineal from insects, kermes from scale bugs, or the costly Tyrian purple that devoured thousands of shellfish for a single garment. Wealth was measured in shades, and the dyer's hand created them all. The labour was endless. Cloth had to be soaked, wrung, and soaked again, dipped repeatedly until the colour clung deep into the fibres. Arms ached from hauling heavy fabric dripping with liquid, backs bent under constant strain. Burns were common from the boiling vats, and skin cracked or blistered where dyes seeped through. Yet there was no pause, for fashion knew no mercy, and markets demanded more. The fumes were their silent enemy. Clouds of vapor rose from the vats, filling lungs with poisons unseen. Many dyers coughed blood, their breath shortening over years of toil. Some grew blind from exposure to chemicals, their sight stolen by the very colors they brought into being. The craft that gave splendor to others consumed its masters slowly, leaving bodies frail long before their time. Though their health decayed, the dyers bore a peculiar prestige. To drape oneself in deep crimson or royal blue was to display wealth, and such garments commanded high prices. Guilds rose among them, guarding secrets of recipes and techniques, protecting their rights in towns. Their names were seldom cursed as others were, for society respected the product even if it overlooked the pain behind it. Still, suspicion lingered in whispers. Some dyes smelled foul, others stained not just fabric, but skin, marking the workers' hands permanently. Children knew them by their stained fingers and weary eyes, and when disease swept through, many accused the fumes of spreading illness, as if the dyers themselves carried pestilence. Revered and reviled, their role was caught between necessity and fear. What strikes me most is the irony. The richest hues came from the poorest conditions. To walk in a hall lined with nobles in garments of emerald and scarlet was to witness the hidden cost of dye baths, where men choked on vapors. Splendor masked suffering, and elegance was draped in mortality. The truth of beauty in those days was darker than the cloth revealed. I think now of their vats, steaming under open skies, and the men and women bending tirelessly above them. They gave the world color, yet lived in shadows. Their health bled into fabrics carried to courts and cathedrals. Their names do not survive, but their craft endures in every painted window and woven tapestry. The dyers gave the Middle Ages its palette, though the price was drawn from their own flesh. The clang of hammer upon anvil echoed through towns and castles, a sound as constant as church bells. In the armorer's forge, fire glowed fierce, consuming coal and breath alike. Men bent over anvils, their arms heavy with iron and steel, shaping plates that would one day shield a knight's body. Theirs was not the glory of battle, but the toil of preparation, every strike of hammer carrying the weight of another's life. Steel did not yield easily. Hours were spent heating, striking, and cooling, the rhythm punishing upon shoulders and wrists. Sparks leapt like angry stars, burning skin and blinding eyes that dared stare too close. Leather aprons charred, gloves stiffened, and sweat poured in streams, for the forge was hotter than any summer sun. The body bore the marks of fire long before its years grew old. The precision demanded was relentless. A helmet too narrow crushed the head, a breastplate too loose split beneath a lance. Armorers measured with care, for mistakes cost lives in battlefields where mercy was rare. Each rivet, each hinge, each curve mattered, not for beauty alone, but for survival. They bore the burden of responsibility heavier than the steel they forged. Fumes rose from heated metal, carrying poisons into the lungs. Lead from soldering, arsenic from certain alloys, and smoke from endless fuel blackened their chests with disease. Many coughed their lives away, their bodies weakened while their craft endured. Yet the need for armor was constant, as kingdoms clashed and knights rode endlessly to war. The armorer's labor was never still. Beyond the forge, they carried a strange place in society. They were respected for their skill, for every lord needed their hand, yet they remained bound to their craft, rarely stepping into the halls their work protected. Unlike the knight, whose armor shone in tournaments and battles, the armorer stood in shadows, his glory hidden behind soot and scars. Recognition seldom reached his name. Guilds gave them a measure of brotherhood. Within these halls, secrets of tempering steel and shaping mail were passed from master to apprentice. Pride lived in those traditions, and the finest armourers earned commissions from kings, their creations carried across Europe. Still, even masters returned to the same forge fires, for their craft allowed no escape from the heat that birthed it. Accidents were common, molten metal spilling onto feet, tongs slipping, hammers missing their mark. Broken bones and burns were not exceptions but the rhythm of the trade. Each day brought new danger, yet each day they returned, for the demand never waned. Without them, nights were bare, castles unguarded, and the engines of war left silent. Their suffering was woven into the armour of Christendom itself. I think now of those forges, the roar of flame and the pounding of iron, the men who laboured until their breath faltered. They gave knights their strength, though their own bodies weakened with every stroke. Their craft shaped history, though their names faded in smoke. The armourer was the silent guardian behind every gleaming helm, a craftsman who fought his battles not with a sword, but with fire and steel. In dim chambers lit by flickering lamps, strange vessels bubbled and hissed, their fumes curling upward like whispers of hidden knowledge. The alchemist sat in robes stained with powders, searching for secrets of transmutation and eternal life. Beside him stood the assistant, younger, poorer, and far more vulnerable, tasked with grinding minerals, stoking fires, and breathing the very vapours that promised wisdom but delivered only sickness. Their days began and ended with the scent of sulphur and smoke. The work demanded patience, for metals were crushed into fine dust, mixed with mercury or arsenic, and heated in crucibles that glowed red in the furnace. These tasks fell not to the master, but to the assistant, whose hands grew raw from constant grinding, whose lungs filled with particles too fine to escape. The alchemist's theories lived in parchment and ink, but the apprentice's suffering lived in flesh and bone. Mercury, quick to shimmer and deadly to touch, was handled with bare hands, its poison seeping silently into the body. Many assistants trembled with palsy before their years reached maturity, their nerves ruined by what they carried daily. Burns too were frequent, as mixtures sparked or flared without warning. The pursuit of gold, or the philosopher's stone, demanded lives as payment long before yielding any miracle. Their reward was often meagre. A bed in the master's house, scraps of food, and the faint hope of learning secrets that might one day elevate them. Few assistants rose to mastery, for many died too soon, their bodies wasted by invisible poisons. The dream of wealth and power hung always before them, yet it remained as elusive as the vapour rising from their furnaces. The chambers where they worked were often hidden, for suspicion followed alchemy. Neighbours whispered of sorcery, of dealings with the devil, and priests frowned upon experiments that strayed beyond God's order. Assistants carried this stigma into the streets, marked as dangerous, even when they were little more than servants condemned to illness. To endure the work was to live at the edge of mistrust, yet alchemy was not only folly. It laid groundwork for what we now call chemistry, recording observations of metals, minerals, and reactions with painstaking care. The assistants' toil, though brutal, fed this slow gathering of knowledge. They were the hands behind discoveries, though history seldom grants them acknowledgement. Their suffering became the foundation upon which later generations would build. I recall how some assistants clung to faith, believing their suffering would bring not only knowledge but redemption, as if bearing the pains of poison was a form of sacrifice. Others cursed their lot, but hunger chained them to the bench, and ambition drove them to endure what they knew could kill them. Hope and despair mixed in those chambers as readily as any concoction in glass. When I picture them now, I see gaunt figures hunched over mortar and pestle, the glow of flames painting their weary faces. They were shadows in the pursuit of light, their bodies spent so that their masters might chase impossible dreams. Theirs was a labour of poison masked as promise, a road paved with suffering toward knowledge that would one day bloom, but too late for them to see. High above the ground, where winds cut sharp and scaffolds swayed, stone masons carved the bones of Christendom. Cathedrals and castles did not rise by miracle, but by the steady chisel and hammer of these men, whose hands turned raw stone into arches that still touch the sky. Their craft demanded precision, for a single error could topple walls or shatter statues meant to honor saints. They lived with danger at every height, yet their work gave glory to both God and King. The quarries yielded massive blocks, hauled by oxen and men to building sites. Once there, masons split, shaped, and lifted them into place, their muscles straining under weights beyond reason. Ropes frayed, scaffolds cracked, and dust clouded the air, stinging eyes and lungs alike. A moment's slip sent men crashing from heights, their bodies broken on the stones they once shaped. Death was a companion, uninvited yet always present. Dust, too, carved its mark upon their lives. Breathing it daily, their lungs hardened and faltered, leaving coughs that never ceased. Yet the masons pressed on, for their wages, though modest, offered stability many others lacked. To belong to a masons' guild was to belong to a brotherhood, a network of men bound by craft and secrecy, respected more than most who toiled with hands alone. Their knowledge stretched beyond cutting stone. They mastered geometry, proportion, and balance, skills learned through years of apprenticeship. With compass and square, they planned the soaring vaults and flying buttresses that seemed to defy nature itself. Though few could read scripture, they read stone, and through it spoke a language of endurance that outlasted parchment and ink. Their cathedrals became sermons carved in rock. For all their respect, life was harsh. Many lived simply, spending wages on bread, ale, and shelter near the sites of their work. Their families shared the dust and danger, wives washing clothes blackened by quarry filth, children growing in the shadow of scaffolds. They were honoured in name, yet often forgotten in comfort, their lives spent for visions greater than themselves. Still, pride ran deep among them. To point at a spire piercing the heavens and say, "My hands shaped that stone," was a claim few could equal. Their work was slow, often lasting decades, so that some masons died before seeing the completion of the very walls they built. Yet in this, they found meaning, knowing their craft stretched beyond their years into eternity. Stories tell of lodges where masons gathered, sharing meals, tools, and secrets, marking themselves as a fraternity distinct from other trades. Trust was sacred, for the weight of a stone wall relied not only on mortar, but on the brother at your side. Camaraderie softened the danger, though it could not erase it. Their guilds carried traditions forward, long after the men themselves lay buried. I think of them when I stand before a cathedral, its towers still cutting the horizon after centuries. Behind every carved saint and every arch of stone lie countless lives spent in sweat and peril. The masons built not only walls, but symbols, raising monuments of faith that endure while their own names have faded into dust. Their legacy rests in every stone that has yet to fall. In smoky kitchens and small alehouses, the alewife tended her vats, stirring boiling wort that foamed and hissed with life. Brewing was not merely a craft, but survival, for ale was safer to drink than much of the water in medieval towns. Women carried this burden most often, transforming grain into drink that sustained peasants and nobles alike. Yet behind the clinking of mugs lay hours of exhausting and dangerous toil. The process demanded fire, heat, and patience. Barley was malted, dried, and ground, then boiled with herbs or hops in cauldrons that spat and steamed. Burns scarred arms and faces as kettles tipped, or flames flared too high. The air grew thick, heavy with smoke and yeast, leaving the body weary and lungs aching. The brew itself turned sour easily, forcing the alewife to begin anew. Risk was not only physical, but legal. Medieval towns regulated ale with strict laws, setting measures for purity and price. Inspectors, often men of standing, tasted her product, and if found weak or watered, punishment could be swift and humiliating. Some were fined, others publicly shamed, their barrels poured into the streets. To brew was to balance livelihood against constant scrutiny. Yet the demand never ceased. Ale was drunk daily, at every meal, by every hand from monk to labourer. Children sipped weaker brews, while soldiers and sailors consumed stronger ones before marching or sailing. The alewife's work, though hidden in kitchens and yards, kept entire communities nourished. She bore the weight of thirst upon her shoulders, though few raised a cup in her honour. Profit was possible, though uneven. Some women grew prosperous, their names known in markets, their brews sought by taverns. Others barely scraped by, labouring day and night, their earnings swallowed by rent and grain costs. Brewing gave women a rare space in commerce, a foothold in towns where opportunities for female independence were scarce. It was a door to freedom, though narrow and dangerous. Accidents came easily in such work. Heavy casks crushed feet, fires leapt onto skirts, and smoke blinded weary eyes. A misjudged batch turned poisonous, sickening those who drank it, bringing not only shame but ruin. The alewife walked a knife's edge, where one misstep could end both her trade and her place in the town. Her courage was measured in each new brew. Her presence lingered in folklore and song, sometimes mocked as drunken or dishonest, other times praised as generous and skilled. The alewife stood at a crossroads of respect and suspicion, much like the drink she brewed, comforting yet never fully trusted. She became both servant and entrepreneur, tied to her vats, yet essential to daily life. Her image was woven into the fabric of medieval taverns. I recall them now, bent over steaming pots, hands reddened by heat, eyes sharp with determination. They brewed not only ale, but survival, pouring their labour into vessels that quenched the thirst of kingdoms. In their hidden work lay a quiet power, one that carried towns through hunger, sickness, and celebration alike. The alewife's legacy foamed in every cup, though history seldom remembered her name. Within the stillness of monasteries and chancery halls, the scribe bent over his desk, quill in hand, eyes fixed upon parchment. Candles burned low, dripping wax upon tables, while the scratch of ink upon vellum filled the silence. Hour after hour, line by line, sacred texts and royal decrees came into being through his labour. He carried no sword, yet his weapon was patience, his battlefield the page. The work demanded a steady hand and perfect attention. A single mistake could mean an entire page scraped away, days of effort lost. Parchment was costly, and errors were punished by masters who tolerated no flaw. Fingers cramped, backs hunched, and eyes strained as the hours stretched into the night. Each letter was carved not in stone, but in flesh and endurance. Ink was brewed from oak galls, soot, or precious pigments, staining the hands of those who wielded it. Colours for illumination, gold leaf, lapis blue, vermilion red, were treasures applied with care. The assistant ground the powders, while the master scribe traced saints, kings, and vines across margins. It was beauty born from exhaustion, a splendour that masked the toll it exacted on the body. Isolation weighed heavily on these men. Cloistered in scriptoria, they worked in silence, speaking little, their companions the saints whose names they copied. The world outside went on with festivals and battles, yet the scribe remained, chained by duty to ink and page. His thoughts grew inward, his spirit narrowed to lines and margins, his humanity pressed between folios. Not all scribes were monks. Some served royal courts or merchant houses, recording charters, contracts, and ledgers. Their burden was no lighter. Endless lists, numbers, and oaths flowed through their hands, binding kingdoms and wealth with the weight of their quills. Mistakes here carried peril as well, for disputes in law or trade could turn upon a single miswritten word. The body rebelled against such a life. Candlelight dimmed the eyes, leaving many nearly blind by middle age. Hands twisted with stiffness, shoulders knotted with pain, and minds grew weary under the monotony of repetition. Yet their work endured beyond them, for manuscripts outlived flesh, carrying prayers, knowledge, and decrees into centuries they would never see. Respect was given, though rarely comfort. Patrons praised fine work. Kings treasured illuminated gospels, yet the scribe himself faded into anonymity. Few names were signed, fewer remembered. Their creations bore glory, but their lives remained hidden behind ink. They gave their years to words, and words claimed them in silence. When I think of scribes, I imagine bent figures in dim halls, the faint glow of gold leaf upon pages, and the weary breath of men who labored so others might read. Their suffering brought forth beauty. Their patience preserved the memory of faith and law. They endured long nights for truths greater than themselves, leaving behind not monuments of stone, but libraries of eternity. At the edge of rivers or upon windy hills, the great silhouettes of mills stood turning, their wheels creaking with the force of water or air. Within, the miller toiled among groaning grindstones, harnessing nature's strength to crush grain into flour. It was a place of rhythm and danger, where stone bit into stone with a sound like thunder, and the air thickened with clouds of dust. To step inside was to breathe in the very heart of labor. Grain arrived in sacks carried by peasants, heavy upon bent backs, their harvests entrusted to the miller's hands. With careful measure, the miller poured it between the stones, watching as golden kernels vanished into white powder. Yet trust was never certain, for accusations of theft or dishonesty often followed him. Few trades bore as much suspicion, for bread was life itself, and any hint of deceit cut deep into hunger. The millstones, massive and relentless, ground endlessly, but they were merciless to flesh. A caught sleeve or careless hand meant bones crushed beyond saving. Children who worked as helpers risked limbs each day, darting between gears and ropes with speed born of necessity. Accidents were frequent, and the echo of screams sometimes mingled with the groan of wood and stone. The mill gave life, but it demanded sacrifice. Dust was as deadly as the stones themselves. The air inside the mill swirled with fine particles, filling lungs until breath grew labored. Miller's lung left men coughing, wheezing, and fading into weakness long before their time. Few reached old age without bearing its mark, and yet the work never stopped, for flour was the sustenance of the kingdom. Despite hardship, the miller held a position of peculiar power. He controlled the flow of grain, deciding the pace at which bread reached the tables of villagers and lords. His toll, taken as a share of flour, fed his own household. Some grew wealthy, their mills thriving, their names known in the parish. Others lived in constant tension, balancing service with suspicion, profit with resentment. Noise was a constant companion, the grind of stone, the rush of water or wind, the clatter of gears, all blended into a ceaseless roar that dulled the senses. To spend years inside such sound was to lose silence, to live in a world where calm was rare. Many millers bore not only scars and coughs, but also a mind wearied by endless tumult. Still, their role was indispensable. Without them, the field's bounty would have rotted in sacks, and bread would never reach the table. Cathedrals, castles, and villages alike depended on the hum of mills, on the patient endurance of those who worked within them. The miller stood as a guardian of sustenance, though seldom as a man beloved. His shadow was cast over every loaf. I picture them now, dust covering hair and clothes, hands roughened by ropes and stone, eyes narrowed against the powder-filled air. They bore suspicion, danger, and weariness, yet they kept the mills turning, day after day. Their endurance fed the multitudes, even as it drained their own strength. The sound of the mill was the sound of survival, echoing across the Middle Ages with every turn of the wheel. From dawn until dusk, the blacksmith's hammer rang like a heartbeat, striking iron with a rhythm that echoed across villages and towns. His forge glowed with unending fire, the air thick with smoke and sparks that leapt like fiery insects. Sweat poured freely, soaking tunics, while arms swung until muscles trembled with exhaustion. To enter his workshop was to step into a world of flame, noise, and unrelenting labor. Iron was his constant companion. Bars of raw metal, heavy and unyielding, became tools, nails, plows, or swords beneath his hand. Each strike demanded precision, for a flaw could shatter a blade in battle or snap a plow in the field. The blacksmith bore responsibility for both survival and war, his craft feeding not only bellies, but also the engines of conflict. His role reached into every life around him. Dangers were ever present. Sparks blinded, molten iron burned, and heavy hammers crushed fingers in a heartbeat. The forge floor was littered with scars, not just on wood and stone, but on flesh. Few smiths escaped without burns upon arms and chest, reminders of moments where iron's fury bit back. Fire was both servant and enemy, granting strength while threatening ruin. Noise filled his ears until silence became a stranger. The clash of hammer upon anvil, the hiss of quenching water, the roar of bellows, all joined in a chorus that deafened slowly but surely. Many smiths grew hard of hearing, their ears no longer able to catch the gentler sounds of life beyond the forge. Their world narrowed to iron's music, harsh and unyielding. Though their work was grueling, blacksmiths held a place of respect. Every community needed them, and their absence meant paralysis. A broken tool, an unshod horse, or an unarmed soldier left households and armies alike vulnerable. Villagers turned to the smith for all manner of needs, and his forge became the heart of local survival. Yet this respect seldom softened the hardships of his daily toil. Their bodies bore the toll of ceaseless strain. Shoulders thickened, hands calloused, spines bent from years of lifting and striking. Breath grew shallow from smoke, eyes dimmed from flame. Yet they endured, for their families depended upon their labor, and society could not function without their skill. To be a blacksmith was to give strength outward while losing it inward. In some towns, guilds formed, protecting their secrets of tempering iron and forging steel. Masters passed knowledge to apprentices, binding generations together through fire. Legends grew around the craft, for men believed the smith held something of magic in his control over metal. Yet beyond such stories lay only sweat, scars, and endless repetition, far removed from the romance sung by poets. When I recall them, I see men glowing in the firelight, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes fierce with determination. They gave the world its tools, its weapons, its very foundation. Their names seldom entered chronicles, yet without their hammers, kingdoms would have starved or fallen silent. The blacksmith's forge was not only a workshop, it was the pulse of medieval life, beating steadily in smoke and flame. Across windswept hills and endless meadows, the shepherd kept watch, staff in hand, eyes never far from the slow drift of wool. His work knew no walls, no hearth, only the open sky and the silence of animals grazing. Seasons passed upon his shoulders, from biting winters that froze his breath to scorching summers that cracked the earth. Solitude was both his burden and his shield, for companionship was scarce upon the fields. Sheep were wealth in the Middle Ages, providing wool for England's looms, meat for the tables of lords, and hides for craftsmen. Yet with such value came constant danger. Wolves prowled in forests, ready to strike at dusk, and thieves lurked on lonely roads, eager to steal what a man could not defend alone. The shepherd's eyes never rested, for each life lost was his shame and his master's anger. Nights were long beneath the stars. Cloaked in rough wool, the shepherd huddled by small fires, listening for the faintest stir in the dark. Bells tied to sheep gave warning, their soft chime carrying across the pasture. Sleep came lightly, broken often, for vigilance was his only ally. The stillness of the countryside masked 1,000 threats hidden in shadow. The flock itself demanded unending care. Lambs needed guiding, the sick required tending, and strays had to be drawn back from dangerous slopes. The shepherd's crook was more than a tool. It was an extension of his will, shaping order from the chaos of wandering beasts. His back bent, his voice called out endlessly, shaping harmony where none existed without him. Isolation gnawed at the spirit. Days passed without a word exchanged, weeks without the comfort of another human face. Songs and prayers filled the silence, simple melodies rising into the wind. Some found peace in such solitude, their souls bound to the rhythm of earth and sky. Others sank into melancholy, their minds worn thin by loneliness. Despite the hardships, shepherds held quiet importance. Without them, the looms of Flanders and Florence would have stood idle, and the wool trade that enriched kings and kingdoms would have faltered. The shepherd's simple labour fed an entire economy, though he himself lived in poverty, clothed in rough garments spun from the very flocks he guarded. His worth was measured, but rarely honoured. The seasons carved him into resilience. He learned to read the weather in clouds, to know the land by its scents, to sense storms before they broke. His knowledge was unwritten, carried only in memory, and passed through word of mouth. He was a man tied to nature's will, surviving not through strength of arms, but through endurance and patience unbroken by years. I recall their silhouettes upon ridges at twilight, staffs in hand, cloaks fluttering against the wind. They lived unnoticed by lords and peasants alike, yet their presence shaped the very fabric of medieval life. Their solitude was the price of warmth upon noble shoulders and meat upon common tables. In every flock that grazed, the shepherd's unseen hand guarded the wealth of nations. The lifeblood of kingdoms did not flow only through armies and markets, but also along lonely paths where messengers rode. With letters sealed in wax and orders bound in leather, they carried the words of kings, bishops and merchants from one town to another. Each journey was a gamble, for the road was long, the weather merciless, and the shadow of thieves never far. Their task was simple in purpose, yet immense in consequence. Some travelled on foot, shoes worn thin, cloaks wrapped tight against rain and wind. Others rode horses, galloping across fields and forests, each hoofbeat measured against time itself. The urgency of their mission often demanded speed beyond endurance, pushing man and beast alike to exhaustion. A missed deadline could mean lost battles, broken treaties, or empty markets. The messenger bore the burden of urgency heavier than his satchel. The dangers of the road were many. Bandits watched bridges and crossroads, striking swiftly at travellers alone. Wild animals prowled the forests, wolves or boars that tore through the unprepared. Storms flooded paths and snow buried tracks, leaving the traveller to wander in peril. Each step forward was measured against death, yet the messenger pressed on, for failure was not permitted. Their payment was modest, seldom matching the risks endured. Many were servants pressed into duty, others were hired hands without power to refuse. Some rode under the banner of royal posts, where the seal of authority gave a measure of protection. But even kings could not guard every mile of road, and the wax on a letter was a poor shield against an arrow or blade. The weight of their work stretched beyond safety. They carried not only words, but secrets, binding together the fragile web of kingdoms and courts. A message lost could shift the fate of battles, or undo months of diplomacy. Their lips were bound as firmly as their letters, for to betray what they carried was to invite execution. Trust was their constant companion, even when comfort was absent. Loneliness shadowed their steps. Hours passed with only the sound of wind and hooves, days with no voice but their own. Taverns offered brief respite, yet suspicion often followed strangers with no wares but parchment. They lived between worlds, never fully of the towns they visited, never fully free of the road that consumed them. Their homes were made of miles, and yet their role was indispensable. Without them, knowledge faltered, armies scattered, merchants found themselves adrift in silence. The flow of letters was the flow of power, and the messenger was its unseen vessel. Their names rarely entered chronicles, yet their steps stitched kingdoms together as surely as any treaty or cathedral. I picture them now, cloaked and weary, lanterns swinging at dusk, a horse's breath rising in clouds before them. Their paths wound through forests and valleys, their burdens small in weight but vast in importance. They rode in silence, unheralded, yet carried the voices of rulers and the hopes of armies. The messenger was the fragile thread upon which the Middle Ages held its breath. Upon the wide rivers and restless seas, ships moved not only by wind, but by the raw strength of men chained to benches. The rowers bent in unison, their oars plunging into water with a rhythm that beat like a drum of survival. Their bodies strained with every stroke, sweat mixing with salt spray, backs aching under the endless command of the overseer. It was labor that swallowed hours, days, and years. The conditions were merciless. Below deck, air grew foul with smoke, sweat, and the stench of cramped bodies. Light was scarce, hope scarcer still, as men pulled in darkness broken only by slivers of sun through narrow gaps. Blisters tore into raw flesh, calluses hardened, and muscles trembled from unending repetition. Rest was brief, food poor, and thirst a constant companion upon the water. Many were not volunteers but prisoners, debtors, or enslaved men forced into service. Shackled to benches, they rowed without the freedom to rise, their bodies owned by the ship they served. Even free labourers found little dignity in the role, for society looked down upon those who rowed as beasts rather than men. The sea took their strength, but the world denied them honour. Storms brought terror greater than battle. Waves towered above, threatening to swallow both ship and crew, while rowers struggled to keep rhythm against nature's fury. Those who faltered faced whips or death, yet even the strongest arms could not outpace the wrath of the sea. Many vanished beneath waves, their names lost, their toil remembered only in the cargo delivered. Disease crept easily among them. Close quarters bred fevers, sores, and malnutrition that hollowed cheeks and darkened eyes. Salt sores covered skin, infections spread unchecked, and death often claimed men quietly at their benches. There was no burial ground but the sea itself, which swallowed bodies without ceremony. The oars continued to rise and fall, indifferent to the lives extinguished, and yet without them, kingdoms could not thrive. Trade routes carried grain, wine, cloth, and spices that fed cities and enriched rulers. Warships patrolled coasts, bearing soldiers to distant shores, powered by those same unseen arms. Every market stall, every royal feast owed something to the sweat of rowers who never saw the wealth they carried. They were the engine of commerce and conquest alike. Voices of the overseers cut through the air, harsh commands timed with drums that demanded unity. The rower's world was rhythm, an unending cycle of pull and breath, pull and breath. Individuality dissolved into the collective, a sea of men bound together by labour, not choice. Their humanity was reduced to motion, their value measured only in strokes per hour. I remember them as shadows, bent over oars, faces gaunt, bodies hardened yet broken by the same labour. They carved paths across seas, though history scarcely carved their names. Their work was relentless, their reward meagre, their dignity denied. Yet in the rise and fall of their oars, the medieval world moved forward, built upon the silence of men who rowed unseen. Beneath the shadow of churchyards, the gravedigger bent his back to the earth, spade striking soil with a sound that echoed like prayer. His work did not wait for seasons, nor did it rest with feast days, for death knew no pause. Whether the ground was soft with spring rain or frozen solid beneath winter frost, graves had to be opened. Few trades carried such constancy, and fewer still carried such sorrow. The earth was not easily moved. In summer it baked hard, resisting the blade, while in winter it turned to stone beneath the frost. Hours stretched into aching days, each spadeful of soil won through sweat and patience. Muscles grew weary, hands blistered, yet the labor could not falter. To delay was to deny the dead their place of rest and the living their peace. The burden grew heavy in times of plague. When death swept through villages in waves, the gravedigger faced trenches rather than single plots, filling them with bodies wrapped hurriedly in cloth. There was no time for ceremony, no space for proper farewells, only the pressing need to contain the dead. His spade became a weapon against contagion, though it offered little defense to the man who wielded it. Exposure was constant. The smell of decay lingered, seeping into clothes and skin, a scent that marked him apart from others. Some believed his presence carried sickness, and so he was shunned, left to his solitude even when his work was most needed. He lived at the edge of community, bound closer to the dead than the living. Loneliness was his shadow as much as the graves he dug. Payment was low, often little more than coin from the church or scraps from mourners. Yet despite the meagerness, the job was steady, for death was the one certainty of medieval life. In famine, in plague, in war, the gravedigger's labor was never idle. His spade struck earth as reliably as the bell that tolled for each passing soul. Children sometimes joined the work, carrying soil or tools, learning early the weight of mortality. Families of gravediggers often inherited the task, bound by poverty to continue the trade. The cycle of labor passed from father to son, shaping generations who knew the touch of earth and sorrow more intimately than most. It was a heritage of endurance rather than pride. Though despised by many, there was a strange dignity in his role. Without him, bodies would fester in streets, disease would flourish, and sanctity would be denied. He gave the dead their final rest, and the living a measure of order in a world of chaos. His task was humble, yet it upheld the foundations of both faith and community. I see him now, shoulders bent beneath sky and storm, spade glinting faintly in the fading light. He carved silence into the ground, line by line, grave by grave, while bells tolled above. His name is not remembered, but the earth remembers his labor, and the stones still mark the resting places he prepared. The gravedigger lived among sorrow, yet his hands granted peace. In dim workshops where shadows clung to walls, candle makers bent over steaming vats, stirring tallow, beeswax, or whale fat into molten pools. The air was thick with smoke and rancid odor, for animal fat carried with it the stench of death long after the slaughter. From this foulness came light, the humble flame that guided monks in prayer, nobles in feasts, and peasants in cottages. Darkness was kept at bay by labor steeped in reek and danger. The process was slow, requiring patience and repetition. Wicks were dipped again and again into hot liquid, each layer cooling before the next was applied. Hours passed in endless cycles, hands reddened by rising steam, arms weary from lifting. Mistakes spilled scalding fat across skin, leaving scars that lingered for life. To make light was to endure fire, not bask in it. Tallow, the cheapest material, was most common, yet it filled the air with a stench that clung to clothes and hair. Beeswax burned sweeter and brighter, but its rarity made it a luxury reserved for churches and the wealthy. The candlemaker's livelihood often meant standing ankle-deep in filth, surrounded by barrels of fat spoiling in the heat, the smell too strong for many to bear. Fire was both tool and hazard. Workshops filled with boiling vats were tinderboxes waiting to ignite. One overturned pot could send flames racing across floors slick with fat, devouring wood and flesh alike. Candlemakers lived with this constant threat, for their craft demanded proximity to fire more intimate than most men dared. Each day was a dance with risk, each night a prayer of survival. Their health faltered under constant exposure, smoke-scarred lungs, leaving coughs that deepened year by year. Eyes smarted, vision blurred, and headaches throbbed beneath fumes that had no escape. The work followed them home, the scent of fat and wax woven into their very skin, marking them as surely as any badge of trade. To others, they were men of odour before they were men of craft. Despite the hardship, their candles were indispensable. Churches demanded them in vast numbers for altars, rituals, and processions. Townsfolk relied upon them in markets and homes, for the sun's setting brought a darkness no man could endure without flame. The candlemaker's craft lit the Middle Ages, though its makers remained hidden in smoke and toil. Their work was never praised, but always consumed. Children sometimes aided in the trade, carrying wicks, pouring moulds, or tending fires too heavy for their years. Their small hands bore burns as easily as their elders, their lungs filled with the same smoke. Whole families became bound to the craft, generation after generation, laboring in fumes for the sake of survival. What they produced burned quickly, but their labor consumed a lifetime. When I remember them, I see men and women bent in haze, hands stained with wax, eyes dimmed by years of fire. They gave the world its light, yet dwelled in shadow themselves, their names forgotten though their flames guided kings and peasants alike. Their legacy flickered in every candle set upon an altar or table, proof that even the foulest toil could kindle illumination. In the hollows of hills and the open scars of valleys, quarrymen struck the earth with picks and hammers, carving stone from its ancient bed. Their task was brutal, tearing blocks of limestone, granite, or marble to feed the needs of cathedrals, castles, and bridges. The sound of iron on rock rang without rest, echoing across fields, carried on the wind as a song of labor. It was work that demanded strength beyond measure, yet rewarded with little more than survival. Stone did not yield willingly. Men drove wedges into cracks, pounding until fissures split open, releasing massive blocks that could crush life in an instant. Dust filled the air, choking lungs and coating skin in pale grit. Under the summer sun, heat reflected off rock until the quarry burned like an oven. In winter, frozen stone resisted every strike, turning hours of effort into meager gain. Accidents were relentless. Blocks slipped from ropes, crushing legs or spines. Cliffs crumbled without warning, burying men alive. Few who worked long escaped without scars, missing fingers, broken bones, twisted backs. The quarry demanded tribute of flesh and blood as surely as it yielded stone. Death was a familiar presence, walking the same paths as the men who labored daily beneath its weight. Yet what they built endured. From their toil rose the walls of Chartres, the spires of Cologne, the battlements of English castles. Their stone formed bridges that still cross rivers, town walls that still embrace cities. Each block carried upward by oxen and rope bore within it the silent testament of unseen hands. Though their names were lost, their craft stood against centuries of storm and time. The community of quarrymen was one of grit and resilience. They lived close to their work, in huts stained with dust, their families breathing the same air of stone. Children played among rubble heaps. Women washed clothes in water turned white with lime. Entire villages grew around quarries, bound together by the same harsh rhythm of earth-breaking labor. Guilds gave some protection, regulating wages and methods, but the quarryman's lot was never easy. Pay was small compared to risk, and many worked for lords who demanded endless supply without regard for the men who supplied it. The promise of steady work kept them chained to danger, for stone was always needed and poverty offered no refuge. Their bodies bore the toll of years. Lungs weakened, spines bent, eyes dulled from dust and glare. Yet they pressed on, for the stone they raised outlasted them, and perhaps they took comfort knowing their children would one day walk beneath walls they had quarried. Legacy was carved not in their names, but in the very bones of Europe, stone upon stone. I see them still, swinging hammers under the sun, sweat darkening tunics, dust clinging to hair and beard. They labored without glory, but their craft shaped kingdoms and sanctuaries. The quarryman's hand is invisible in chronicles, yet visible in every cathedral tower, every fortress wall. Their toil was silent, but their monuments still speak. Behind the grand halls and richly decorated chambers of castles moved silent figures whose hands kept life in motion. Servants rose before dawn, tending fires, carrying water, and scrubbing floors until their backs ached. Their presence was constant yet invisible, for their labor was meant to be unseen. Nobles dined, prayed, and feasted, while others bent in shadows, sustaining the comfort of the few. The tasks stretched endlessly. Kitchens demanded wood and water, halls required sweeping, and garments needed mending. Children of lords cried for attention, dogs for feeding, guests for service. Each demand fell upon the shoulders of those without voice or power. The hours blurred, for labor knew neither morning's beginning nor night's end. Every moment was claimed by duty. Many servants were children themselves, sold or given into households by desperate families. They scrubbed pots too heavy for their arms, carried loads beyond their strength, and endured sharp words for the smallest mistake. Childhood was traded for servitude, and laughter was scarce in the echoing corridors of stone. Their hands bore the roughness of age before their years had truly begun. Humiliation was part of the service. Masters scolded, mistresses corrected, and higher servants often scorned those beneath them. Whippings or beatings were not rare, for punishment was seen as discipline, and servants had no voice against it. To endure meant survival, to resist meant dismissal or worse. In this silence, the servant's spirit was tested daily. Yet within this harshness, bonds sometimes formed. Servants shared scraps of food, whispered stories by the hearth, and offered each other comfort against cold and cruelty. They forged a kind of family in the margins of noble life, their solidarity the only defense against the weight of servitude. These ties gave strength where none else could be found. Though their labor was unending, rewards were few. Wages, when given, were meager, often barely enough to buy bread. Some households offered shelter and food, but little else. Escape was rare, for poverty bound them to service as firmly as chains. Still, the chance to remain near wealth and power offered a hope, however faint, for a better future. The contrast was striking. Nobles feasted upon golden plates, while servants lingered at the edges, awaiting crumbs. Yet without the unseen work of these hands, the splendor of courts and castles would collapse. They were the quiet machinery of power, sustaining the illusion of ease and majesty that the world admired from afar. Their toil held together the life of the privileged. I picture them now, heads bowed, arms weary, moving silently through chambers lit by torch and candle. They had no songs written of their deeds, no monuments carved in their memory. And yet, their presence was woven into every banquet, every feast, every comfort enjoyed by those who never touched toil. The servant's endurance was the hidden foundation of noble life. In quiet workshops filled with the scent of wood shavings and feathers, fletchers carved the weapons that shaped wars. Their benches were cluttered with shafts, arrowheads, and goose quills, each piece waiting to be bound into deadly precision. The rhythm of knives against wood, the hiss of thread pulled tight, and the crack of drying glue marked their hours. They did not march upon the battlefield, yet their craft determined its outcome. The shaft was chosen with care, often from ash or birch, for strength and straightness mattered above all. Each stick was smoothed by hand, splinters removed until it was worthy to fly true. Arrowheads of iron were fitted with skill, hammered and sharpened to pierce armor or flesh. Every step demanded patience, for a single flaw meant failure in the moment of need. Feathers gave the arrow its voice. Split and trimmed, they were bound in threes along the shaft, guiding flight with precision. The fletcher's fingers grew calloused from cutting and binding, stained by pitch and glue. Small cuts and punctures were constant companions, but the repetition left little time to heal. The work demanded both craft and endurance, for armies required thousands, where one man could make but dozens. The pressure of war weighed heavily upon them. During the 100 Years' War, English kings demanded vast numbers of arrows, each campaign consuming them by the chestful. Fletchers laboured day and night, bending their backs to the needs of armies that stretched across France. Their labour fed the longbowmen whose arrows darkened skies and turned battles into slaughter. Though essential, they lived in modest means. Payment came in bulk, often under guild regulation, but wealth seldom followed. They were respected for their craft, yet never revered, for their work remained tied to war, not peace. The beauty of a fine arrow vanished in an instant, buried in flesh or earth, leaving no trace of the hands that shaped it. The dangers were subtle, but real. Iron dust from sharpening arrowheads crept into lungs, leaving coughs that worsened with years. Glue and resin burned skin, while hours of bending and cutting twisted joints and stiffened hands. Their bodies bore the memory of every arrow as much as the arrows bore the imprint of their touch. In guild halls, secrets of the trade were guarded closely. Masters trained apprentices in the art of balance and proportion, passing on traditions that gave England its feared longbow supremacy. Pride lingered in this heritage, though it was pride woven from necessity rather than luxury. Their skill was quiet power, hidden in bundles carried to the field. I think of them now, bent over shafts by candlelight, eyes weary yet hands steady, preparing arrows that would never bear their names. Their craft left no monuments, only silence after the storm of battle. And yet, each shaft carried a piece of their endurance, flying across centuries in the memory of wars won and lost. The Fletcher's work was invisible, but its mark pierced history. In towns where hearths glowed through winter nights, chimneys rose like veins of smoke into the sky. Yet with every season, soot thickened within them, threatening fire or suffocation. Into these narrow shafts children were sent, small enough to wriggle where grown men could not. With brushes or bare hands, they scraped the blackened walls, their bodies pressed against stone, lungs filling with dust. Darkness closed around them like a grave. The passages were tight, often no wider than the sweep himself. Scraped knees and torn skin were constant, soot grinding into wounds until infection festered. Many climbed barefoot, using elbows and ribs to push upward, their tiny frames chosen for suffering more than for skill. Some became stuck in the narrowest flues, and the silence that followed was a weight no one wished to name. Above ground, soot rained from chimneys as proof of work done, but below, the sweeps coughed until their chests burned. Soot settled deep into lungs, leaving a sickness that followed them all their days. Many grew weak before reaching adulthood, their bodies failing from years of black dust. The price of warmth for households was paid in the health of those unseen. The danger of fire was never far. Chimneys caught sparks easily, and children climbed through flues still warm from recent flames. Burns marked arms and feet, scars that never faded, reminders of fires barely escaped. Even the tools they carried could betray them, brushes snapping, ropes fraying, leaving them alone within stone walls that offered no escape. Despite this peril, the pay was meagre. Families sent children to sweep not out of choice, but of hunger, for every coin counted in poverty. The sweeps lived on scraps, often sleeping in cellars or alleys, soot-stained and despised. Townsfolk wrinkled their noses at their appearance, forgetting that their own hearths burned safely because of such toil. Respect was absent, though reliance was constant. Work began before dawn, when fires had dimmed, and continued until nightfall. Chimneys of taverns, castles, and homes all demanded clearing, for no building was free from the creeping danger of soot. Each day blurred into the next, a rhythm of climbing, scraping, coughing, and descending. Childhood was consumed in blackness, replaced by exhaustion far beyond their years. Some masters of the trade trained apprentices, binding boys to their service until manhood. These bonds offered food and shelter, yet they chained lives to soot and smoke. Few escaped to better trades, for their bodies bore the mark of the chimney, the hacking cough, the stunted frame, the blackened skin. The path of the sweep was narrow, like the chimneys themselves. I remember them not in the warmth of fire, but in the silence of narrow shafts, their voices muffled by stone, their breath heavy with soot. They gave safety to households yet lived without it themselves, children swallowed by labour too cruel for their years. Their names are not carved in records, but their toil burned quietly in every hearth that glowed through the night. High within towers where winds howled and shadows lengthened, the bell ringer grasped ropes thick with wear. With each pull, the bronze giants above stirred, their deep voices rolling across towns and valleys. Bells called peasants to prayer, warned of fire, or marked the hours of a day. Yet for the one who set them in motion, each toll was a weight borne in body and ear alike. The ropes demanded strength, for bells weighed hundreds, even thousands of pounds. Ringers pulled with all their might, shoulders wrenching, hands blistering as the cords burned their skin. When the bells swung violently, the force could lift a man from his feet or dash him against the beams. Accidents left bones broken, and lives ended within the very towers meant to sanctify. The sound itself was its own punishment. Within the belfry, the toll was deafening, vibrating through bone and chest, leaving ears ringing long after silence returned. Over years, hearing dulled to nothing, leaving the bell ringer in a world of muted sound. The music that guided the faithful often condemned its maker to silence. Their work was relentless. Dawn bells stirred towns to life, noon bells marked labour's height, and evening bells closed the day. In times of danger, fire or invasion, the ringer raced to the ropes, often alone in the night, to summon the people. The town's safety hung upon his vigilance, yet his name was seldom spoken with thanks. Festivals and feasts brought no rest. Bells pealed for hours in celebration, ringing in weddings or coronations, each toll demanding the same effort as the last. The joy of others meant greater strain for the ringer, whose body bent beneath duty even as the crowd below danced. Their role was woven into both sorrow and joy, though their own life was marked by neither. Churches and guilds sometimes offered small wages, enough to keep food upon the table, but rarely enough for comfort. Many ringers served not out of choice but obligation, drawn from poorer families, their lives tied to towers they did not own. Their dwelling was often near the church, their world bound within the sound of the bells. And yet, despite hardship, their task held deep meaning. Bells did more than measure time. They carried faith, power, and unity across miles. They announced death and birth, war and peace, famine and feast. The ringer, though deafened and weary, was the unseen hand that gave voice to the soul of a community. I see them still, pulling ropes with bodies swaying, sweat mingling with dust, faces lit only by candle flame. Their ears rang with thunder, yet they did not falter, for each toll carried weight greater than themselves. In their sacrifice, the bells gained life, and in their silence, the world gained sound. The bell ringer was both prisoner and master of time itself. Along rivers, lakes, and coasts, the fisherman cast his nets into waters that promised both life and death. Boats rocked upon waves, flimsy against the weight of storm and sea, while hands calloused from rope and oar pulled tirelessly. Fish was not only food, but salvation, demanded by nobles and monasteries alike, especially in times of fasting when meat was forbidden. The fisherman's world was hunger and hope bound to the water's edge. The labour was harsh from the first light of dawn. Nets soaked and heavy dragged shoulders low, ropes cut into flesh, and the salt stung open wounds. Winter brought numbness, freezing men to the bone, while summer scorched their backs beneath open skies. Each catch came at the price of pain, yet without it, villages would have gone unfed. Their toil sustained far more than their own households. Storms were the greatest terror. Sudden winds lashed waves into mountains, overturning boats with ease. Lightning split the skies, rain blinded eyes, and men vanished into the depths with no burial but the sea. Families waited on shores, staring at horizons that gave no answer, the silence of water heavier than any grave. The sea was as cruel as it was generous. Hunger sharpened the edge of their struggle. Catches were uncertain, sometimes abundant, sometimes meager. When nets came up empty, bellies did too, and debts deepened. Fishermen lived at the mercy of both nature and market, for merchants paid as they pleased, and lords took their share regardless of the yield. Poverty was as constant as the tides. Disease crept into their lives as well. Wet clothes clung to skin, inviting fevers that spread through villages. Wounds from hooks and knives festered, salt water offering no healing. Parasites from fish made men sick, yet still they worked, for the choice was not between health and labour, but between labour and starvation. The sea demanded sacrifice in flesh as much as in time. Their tools were simple but vital. Nets woven by hand, boats carved from timber, and lines baited with scraps sustained the trade. In some regions, larger communities built fish weirs or traps along rivers, forcing fish into confined spaces. These methods fed monasteries, armies, and towns, their quiet ingenuity shaping survival even when little else could. Despite their struggles, fishermen often held a place of quiet respect. They supplied the tables of bishops, abbots, and kings, though their own meals were poor. In markets, their wares brought life to fasting days when bread and fish became the foundation of survival. Still, they remained bound to hardship, their lives swallowed by the very waters that defined their worth. When I remember them, I see weary figures hauling dripping nets at dawn, faces hardened by wind, eyes fixed on the uncertain horizon. Their world was never stable, always shifting with tide and storm, yet they endured. The fisherman's lot was peril and hunger, yet from his labour came sustenance for countless souls. His legacy floated upon waters that took as much as they gave. In the bustle of medieval markets, the butcher stood over blocks of wood darkened by years of blood and blade. Animals were slaughtered in the open air, their cries mingling with the clamour of trade, their carcasses hung for all to see. The work was brutal, unending, and necessary, for meat was prized in feasts and daily meals alike. Yet the cost of such labour marked the butcher's body and spirit in ways few could bear. Knives and cleavers were their constant tools. With swift strokes, hides were stripped, bones cracked, and flesh portioned into cuts demanded by customers. Mistakes meant not only wasted meat, but injury, for a slip could sever fingers or worse. The ground beneath their feet was slick with offal, each step a hazard as much as each cut. Danger and filth intertwined in every moment of the trade. Disease thrived in such places. Flies swarmed over carcasses, maggots bred in scraps left behind, and foul odours clung to the air. Butchers often worked knee-deep in filth, exposed to blood-borne infections that found easy passage through open cuts. Few among them escaped sickness, and many carried fevers or skin diseases that gnawed at their strength long after markets closed. Despite the stench and gore, their role was indispensable. Lords required banquets, monasteries fed brothers in number, and peasants sought scraps of meat for holy days. The butcher supplied them all, standing at the intersection of hunger and survival. Without his hand, tables would have remained bare, yet his presence was often despised. He was seen as unclean, his trade as coarse and low. Suspicion often followed them. Rumours spread of false weights, of water added to meat, of tricks to cheat the unwary. Some guilds sought to protect reputation, regulating methods and punishing fraud. Yet distrust lingered, for survival sharpened suspicion, and the butcher's hand always seemed too close to profit. Respect was rare, even as demand for his skill never waned. The physical toll was immense. Arms grew thick from endless cutting, but joints stiffened, backs bent, and lungs filled with the stench of years. Cold markets in winter froze fingers until they cracked, while summer heat quickened rot, forcing labour against the clock. Each season brought its own hardships, leaving the butcher weary long before age set in. Yet from their labour came more than sustenance. Bones became broth for the poor, hides went to tanners, and fat to candle makers. The butcher stood at the center of a chain that touched countless trades, his work rippling outward into every corner of medieval life. He was reviled and relied upon in equal measure, cursed in words, but sought in need. I recall them as figures with aprons stiffened by blood, cleavers flashing in morning light, eyes tired yet steady. They bore the disgust of neighbors and the burden of disease, yet they kept the markets alive. Their hands carried the cost of survival, carving sustenance from death itself. The butcher's story was one of necessity, lived at the boundary between hunger and disdain. Before the age of pumps and pipes, water was drawn by hand, lifted from rivers, wells, or public fountains. The water carrier's shoulders bore this endless task, hauling heavy buckets through mud-slick streets and up steep stairs. Each step threatened a spill, each climb pressed weight into bone and muscle. In every town, their labor was unseen yet indispensable, for without them, no hearth or household could endure. The loads were immense. Wooden yokes rested upon shoulders, balancing buckets that sloshed and strained with every movement. In summer, the heat doubled the exhaustion, sweat mingling with river water. In winter, ice froze the handles to their hands, and the cold cracked skin until it bled. Each journey was a battle between body and burden, repeated without mercy day after day. Disease shadowed their trade. Wells were not always clean, and rivers carried filth from towns upstream. Carriers who drank from their loads often sickened, victims of the very water they delivered. Cholera and dysentery spread easily, though none yet understood their cause. To serve life, they risked their own health with every bucket lifted. The work was poorly paid, a few coins per delivery, barely enough to keep hunger at bay. Poverty bound most to the trade, for those with means would not stoop to such toil. Many carriers were women or children, their small frames bent beneath loads far heavier than they could bear. To survive meant to endure pain as a constant companion. Accidents were frequent. Slippery streets sent carriers sprawling, buckets crashing, water spilling into the dirt. Bruises, sprains, and broken bones were common, yet there was no pause, for households demanded more. The punishment for spilled water was not only physical but financial, for each drop lost cut into their meager earnings. Balance was as vital as strength. Despite their lowly status, their importance was absolute. Bakers, brewers, cooks, and households all depended on their labor. Castles required vast amounts daily for kitchens, baths, and horses, and armies relied on carriers when wells ran dry. Though despised for their ragged clothes and weary faces, they were the silent arteries that kept the body of the town alive. Their bodies bore the toll of years. Backs bent permanently, shoulders bruised deep, knees weakened until steps became agony. Many died young, broken not by disease or famine, but by the sheer wear of labor. Few left behind more than worn tools and weary families. Yet their legacy was written in every household that drew water from their hands. I see them still, trudging through narrow streets, yokes across shoulders, buckets swaying, eyes fixed only on the next delivery. They had no guilds, no honors, no monuments, yet their service sustained life as surely as any king's decree. Their toil was heavy and thankless, but without it, the towns of the Middle Ages would have withered in thirst. The water carrier's burden was the world's survival. As twilight faded, a different kind of worker emerged, carrying tools no one envied. The gong farmer was tasked with cleaning cesspits, those foul reservoirs beneath medieval latrines. Armed with buckets, ropes, and long-handled scoops, they descended into darkness where the stench alone could choke a man. Few dared speak of their work, yet every household relied on it. The dangers were more than unpleasant smells. Methane gas built up in the pits, invisible and deadly. A single breath too deep could knock a worker unconscious, never to rise again. Lanterns could not be trusted, for flames risked sudden explosion. Each descent was a gamble, with survival depending on luck as much as strength. Payment came in coin, but often also in leftover food or cast-off clothing. The job was despised, yet oddly secure, for waste never ceased to flow. Many gong farmers were forced into the trade, trapped by poverty or punishment. No noble hand would touch such filth, leaving the poor to shoulder the vilest burdens of urban life. Disease lingered in every breath and smear. Though medieval people did not understand microbes, they knew the work was unclean. The risk of infection was constant, yet necessity overruled fear. Towns would not tolerate overflowing pits, for the smell alone was unbearable. So, the gong farmer laboured where no one else dared, half forgotten until needed again. Tools were crude but effective. Wooden buckets hauled sludge upward, while shovels pushed muck into carts. The stench clung to skin, hair, and clothes, no matter how much they washed. Families of such workers often suffered ostracism, shunned in markets and taverns, marked by a stink that could not be hidden. Social shame weighed as heavy as the work itself. Nighttime was their ally. To avoid disrupting daily life, gong farmers often worked under cover of darkness. Streets lay quiet, but the creak of carts and splash of buckets echoed in silence. By dawn, the filth was gone, carted away to fields where it was spread as fertilizer. In this way, the waste of the city returned to nourish the land. Despite the revulsion, their service was vital. Without them, disease would have spread more swiftly, overwhelming crowded towns. The unseen labour of gong farmers was a fragile barrier against catastrophe. They stood as a grim reminder that survival often depended on those willing to endure the unendurable. It is easy to forget such figures when picturing castles and knights, yet history was shaped as much by their toil as by swords. In the shadow of every city wall, they bent their backs to a task too foul for others to imagine. In their suffering lay a service without which medieval life would have collapsed into its own filth. Before dawn, when the mist lay thick over stagnant waters, leech collectors waded barefoot into swamps and ponds. Their bodies became bait, flesh offered freely to draw the writhing creatures that physicians prized. Each step stirred mud and weeds, and soon dark shapes clung to their skin, drinking deeply before being plucked into jars. It was labour both strange and perilous. The purpose was medical, for leeches were central to the practice of bloodletting. Doctors believed that draining excess blood could balance the body's humours, curing fever, swelling, and madness. Demand was constant, and so collectors braved the marshes again and again. What seemed like a small creature held immense value, turning misery into coin. Yet the work drained more than the ponds. Repeated bites caused weakness, sores, and infections that left collectors pale and frail. Some collapsed from blood loss if the harvest lasted too long. The risk of disease loomed as leeches carried pathogens between host and host, a danger unknown to medieval medicine. Suffering was stitched into every jar filled. Children were often sent into the water, their smaller bodies seen as perfect bait. Poverty forced families to endure this grim trade, turning necessity into inheritance. Generations grew with scars on their legs, each mark a reminder of nights in the mud. Survival left little space for fear, only for the endurance demanded by hunger. Clothing was little protection. Thin garments were useless against the small, persistent jaws. Collectors emerged from the marsh streaked in blood, their jars alive with wriggling prizes. The smell of damp earth and iron followed them into villages, marking their passage like an invisible signature. Few envied them, yet all relied on their catch. Markets welcomed their goods, for physicians and barbers alike stocked leeches in great numbers. Wealthy patients expected the creatures to be available, and without collectors, treatments would falter. Thus, the poor shouldered the filth and pain that allowed the rich to pursue their cures. The imbalance of burden and benefit was stark, yet unquestioned. Beyond the physical toll lay the stigma. Leeches were symbols of corruption and decay, and those who gathered them carried that association. Whispers followed them in towns, branding them as unclean. Their role was vital but despised, a paradox common in medieval life. Work that sustained society was also work that tainted its labourers. In every jar sold lay the cost of hidden suffering, a quiet sacrifice in swamps and shadows. Though their names are lost, the echo of their labour remains in the history of medicine. They were harvesters of blood in a world desperate for healing, proof that even the smallest creature and the poorest hand could shape the fate of lives.